As the wind howled outside, and the snow continued to fall in thick, heavy flakes, I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease settle in the pit of my stomach. I was alone in the isolated cabin, nestled deep within the heart of the unforgiving winter wilderness. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the only connection to the outside world was a rugged dirt road that had long since been buried beneath the relentless snowfall. I had come to this cabin seeking solitude and a break from the chaos of everyday life. It was supposed to be a peaceful retreat, a place to find solace in the embrace of nature. But now, as the eerie silence of the forest was punctuated by strange and unsettling sounds, I couldn't help but question the wisdom of my decision. The first sign that something was amiss had come the previous night. I was cozied up by the fireplace, wrapped in a thick blanket with a cup of hot cocoa in hand, trying to lose myself in a good book. The cabin's old wooden walls creaked with the familiar symphony of the wind outside, and I was lulled into a sense of comfort by the crackling fire. That's when I heard it, a faint, distant sound that sent shivers down my spine. At first, I dismissed it as the wind playing tricks on me, but as the noise grew closer, I couldn't deny that it was real. It was the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching through the snow. I peered out the frosted window, my breath misting up the glass, and saw nothing but the swirling snowflakes and the inky darkness of the forest beyond. The footsteps were getting louder, closer, as if someone, or something, was approaching the cabin. My heart raced as I tried to rationalize the situation. It could be a lost hiker seeking shelter or a wayward animal. But deep down, I knew that it was the isolation of the cabin and the desolation of the surrounding wilderness that made my mind conjure up such sinister possibilities. The footsteps continued, coming closer and closer until they seemed to be just outside the cabin door. I held my breath, my body tense, and the only sound in the room was the roaring fire. Then, without warning, the footsteps stopped abruptly, leaving me in an oppressive silence that seemed to press in from all sides. That night, I lay awake in bed, my mind racing with questions and fear. Who had been out there in the snow? What had they wanted? But exhaustion eventually overtook my anxiety, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep, haunted by dreams of shadowy figures lurking in the woods. The next morning, I awoke to a world transformed by a fresh layer of snow. The events of the previous night felt like a distant nightmare, and I tried to convince myself that I had simply imagined the whole thing. But as I ventured outside to assess the situation, the undeniable evidence of the footsteps in the snow around the cabin told a different story. Determined to regain my sense of peace, I decided to take a long hike through the surrounding forest. The woods were pristine, their beauty untouched by the intrusion of humanity. The snow-covered pines stood tall and majestic, their branches heavy with the weight of winter. It was a serene scene that should have eased my troubled mind, but the memory of the footsteps lingered like a dark cloud. As I walked deeper into the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every rustle of a branch, every gust of wind, sent a shiver down my spine. I quickened my pace, desperate to put distance between myself and the cabin, as if the isolation of the woods had become a more welcoming prospect than the cabin itself. It was during this solitary hike that I saw it, a fleeting glimpse of a figure moving among the trees. It was a mere shadow, a silhouette in the distance, but it was enough to send panic coursing through my veins. I froze in place, my heart pounding, and watched as the figure disappeared into the dense underbrush. I couldn't deny the fear that gripped me. I had seen someone, or something, in the woods, and it was not the work of my imagination. My instinct screamed at me to leave, to retreat to the safety of the cabin and barricade myself inside. But I couldn't ignore the curiosity that gnawed at me. Who was this mysterious figure, and why were they here? Reluctantly, I made my way back to the cabin, my thoughts consumed by the enigma of the forest. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the eyes of some unseen presence were trained on me, tracking my every move. The day wore on, and the cabin felt more like a prison than a sanctuary. I busied myself with mundane tasks, trying to push aside the nagging fear that had taken hold of me. But as the afternoon sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world into darkness once more, I couldn't escape the overwhelming sense of dread. It was when night fell that the true horror began. I was sitting by the fire, the dim glow of the flames casting long, flickering shadows across the room, when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of something moving on the roof. My heart leaped into my throat as I strained to listen. It was as if someone, or something, was crawling across the shingles above, their movements slow and deliberate. I knew it couldn't be an animal, the footsteps were too deliberate, too human-like. In a daze of fear and disbelief, I stumbled to my feet and crept toward the front door, hoping to catch a glimpse of the intruder. But as I reached for the doorknob, a sudden, violent banging echoed through the cabin. It was coming from the window beside me. I turned slowly, my eyes widening in terror, to see a figure standing just outside the frosted glass. It was a shadowy silhouette, tall and menacing, with long, gnarled limbs that seemed to reach for me through the window. Its face was obscured by darkness, but I could feel its malevolent gaze fixed upon me. My mind screamed at me to run, to escape from the cabin and whatever nightmarish presence lurked outside. I fumbled for my phone, my hands trembling, and dialed 911. But when I held the phone to my ear, all I heard was static, as if the wilderness itself was conspiring against me. The knocking on the window grew louder, more insistent, and I knew I had no choice but to flee. I darted toward the back door, flung it open, and stumbled out into the freezing darkness. The snow crunched beneath my boots as I sprinted through the forest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't dare look back, for fear of what I might see. All I knew was that I had to get as far away from that cabin as possible. The forest was a maze of shadows and whispers, and I felt as if I was being pursued by something ancient and malevolent. After what felt like an eternity, I stumbled upon the dirt road that led away from the cabin. I didn't stop running until I reached the nearest town, where I finally found refuge and help. The police arrived at the cabin, but by then, the mysterious figure had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only a trail of fear and unanswered questions. To this day, I can't explain what happened in that isolated cabin in the snowy wilderness. I can't rationalize the footsteps, the shadowy figure in the woods, or the chilling presence that knocked on my window. It remains a mystery, one that haunts my nightmares and leaves me with a deep and abiding fear of the unknown. I may never know the true identity of the mysterious figure that tormented me in that cabin, and perhaps that's for the best. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, and some horrors are better left buried in the depths of the wilderness, where they can haunt the imaginations of those who dare to venture into the unknown. The weekend escape was supposed to be a respite from the chaos of our daily lives, a chance for my friends and me to reconnect with nature and with each other. We had rented a rustic cabin tucked away in the heart of the woods, not far from a tranquil lake that shimmered like a sapphire jewel under the soft glow of the setting sun. It was picturesque, serene, and the perfect setting for a getaway. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest, we gathered around the crackling bonfire in the cabin's backyard. The air was cool, carrying with it the earthy scent of pine and the promise of a peaceful evening. The five of us, James, Sarah, Alex, Emily, and I, clinked our glasses together in a toast to friendship and adventure. The evening was filled with laughter, storytelling, and the occasional eerie tale meant to send shivers down our spines. We were blissfully unaware of the horror that awaited us as we huddled closer to the fire, the flames dancing in our eyes and the night's silence broken only by our mirthful chatter. It was Sarah who first heard it, a distant, haunting sound that cut through the night like a spectral whisper. She tilted her head, her hazel eyes widening with uncertainty. "Did anyone else hear that?" We fell silent, straining our ears to listen. The sound was elusive, a mix of mournful wails and faint splashes that seemed to come from across the lake. I glanced at James, who was the most adventurous among us, and he nodded. "Let's check it out." The idea of an eerie nocturnal adventure appealed to all of us, and we grabbed flashlights before venturing towards the lake. The narrow path was shrouded in darkness, the trees looming over us like silent sentinels. Our footsteps rustled the fallen leaves beneath, and an uneasy feeling crept over me. The sound grew louder as we approached the water's edge. It was as though a ghostly choir sang in the distance, their voices filled with lamentation. The lake stretched out before us, its surface reflecting the faint light of the crescent moon. And there, in the middle of the lake, we saw it, a chilling, white figure. My heart pounded like a drum in my chest as I aimed my flashlight toward the figure. It was indistinct, like a specter rising from the depths, and it seemed to be moving towards us. Panic surged through me, and I whispered, "We need to go back. Now." We turned and hurried back to the cabin, the ominous sounds fading behind us. Once inside, we locked the doors and windows, our breaths ragged with fear. The minutes dragged on as we sat in the dimly lit cabin, our minds racing with questions and doubts. "Did you all see that thing?" Emily asked, her voice quivering. Nods and murmurs of agreement filled the room. We were all shaken by what we had witnessed, but none of us could explain it. The night had transformed from one of camaraderie to one of terror, and we were trapped in this cabin, surrounded by the unknown. The hours passed slowly, the darkness outside pressing in on us like a malevolent force. The sounds of the forest had changed, becoming eerie and unsettling. The once comforting hoots of owls now sounded like ominous warnings, and the rustling leaves became the whispers of unseen watchers. As we huddled together on the cabin's creaky wooden floor, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The atmosphere in the room was thick with dread, and each passing minute deepened our fear. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the first hints of dawn began to break through the cabin's windows. The feeble light brought a glimmer of hope, and we cautiously approached the windows to look outside. What we saw sent shivers down our spines. Fresh footprints, wet and muddy, encircled the cabin. They were large and appeared to lead from the lake right up to the cabin's walls. Panic surged anew as we realized that whatever we had seen in the lake had been much closer than we thought. "We have to leave. Now!" James exclaimed, his voice trembling. We hastily gathered our belongings, our hands trembling as we packed. The eerie silence that had descended upon us was shattered by the urgency of our movements. We didn't bother with breakfast or goodbyes to the cabin, we just needed to escape from this unsettling place. As we rushed out of the cabin, we felt the weight of the unknown pressing down on us. The forest seemed to hold its breath as we piled into our car and sped away from the cabin, leaving behind the nightmares that had plagued our night. The hours that followed were filled with nervous laughter and relieved sighs as we put distance between ourselves and that remote, eerie location. We didn't talk much about what had happened. The memory of that white figure in the lake and the fresh footprints remained etched in our minds. It was only when we reached the safety of the city that we began to open up about our experiences. We searched for explanations, but nothing could rationalize the events of that night. Our getaway had turned into a harrowing encounter with the unknown, leaving us haunted and forever changed. To this day, we still don't know what we saw in that lake or who or what had left those chilling footprints around the cabin. But one thing was certain, we had encountered something beyond our comprehension, something that defied the laws of nature and reason. And as we drove away from that remote wilderness setting, we left behind a piece of our innocence, forever scarred by the unsettling encounter with the unknown. It was a crisp autumn morning when my friend Mark and I decided to escape the hustle and bustle of city life for a weekend getaway. We craved tranquility, the kind that only the woods could provide. We had heard stories about the cabin in the woods from our friends, who spoke of it in hushed tones, as if it held a secret, an aura of mystery that beckoned us to explore it for ourselves. The cabin was nestled deep in the heart of the forest, far away from the nearest town. A small, winding dirt road led us through a dense thicket of trees, their leaves a brilliant tapestry of red, orange, and yellow. The cabin itself appeared as if it had been plucked from a storybook, a quaint wooden structure with a sloping roof and a welcoming porch. As we arrived, the scent of pine and earth filled the air, and the silence was so profound it felt almost sacred. We unloaded our supplies from the car, groceries, firewood, and enough board games to keep us entertained for days. We were prepared for a digital detox, ready to disconnect from the outside world. The first day passed peacefully. We spent the morning hiking through the woods, reveling in the vibrant foliage and the music of nature. In the afternoon, we lit a fire in the cabin's stone fireplace, the crackling flames casting a warm, dancing light around the room. We played cards, sipped whiskey, and relished in the simplicity of the moment. It was everything we had hoped for. As night descended upon the cabin, we retired to our respective bedrooms. The silence of the woods seemed to intensify in the darkness, and the only sound was the occasional hoot of an owl. I was in the middle of a dreamless slumber when a noise, faint but distinct, pulled me from my sleep. It was a soft scraping sound, like someone dragging their fingers across the wooden floorboards. I lay still for a moment, trying to discern if it was just my imagination. But then it came again, more pronounced this time. My heart began to race as I realized that it was not a figment of my imagination, it was real. I gently pushed the covers aside and crept out of my bed, careful not to make a sound. The moonlight filtering through the curtains cast eerie shadows across the room, making it difficult to see clearly. I strained my ears, listening intently for any signs of movement. The scraping sound continued, growing louder and more deliberate. It was coming from the living room, just down the hall from my bedroom. I knew I had to investigate, but fear held me in its icy grip. I considered waking up Mark, but he was a heavy sleeper, and I didn't want to startle him unnecessarily. I reached for the baseball bat we had left by the bedroom door, a precautionary measure we had taken upon arriving at the cabin. Gripping it tightly, I took a deep breath and stepped into the hallway. The moonlight spilled through the cabin's windows, revealing the outlines of furniture and casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. The scraping sound continued, rhythmic and unnerving. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached the living room. And then, I saw it. A figure hunched over in the dim light, its back to me, with long, unkempt hair hanging down. It was scraping something against the wooden floor, producing that spine-chilling noise. My mind raced, and I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. Summoning all the courage I could muster, I raised the baseball bat and called out in a trembling voice, "Who's there?" The figure froze for a moment, as if startled by my presence. Slowly, it turned to face me, revealing a face hidden in shadow. My heart sank as I realized that the intruder was wearing a grotesque mask, a twisted, nightmarish visage that seemed to be grinning menacingly. Without a word, the intruder rose to its feet and lunged toward me, moving with a terrifying speed and agility. Panic overtook me, and I swung the baseball bat with all my strength, connecting with the intruder's masked face. The force of the blow sent the figure crashing to the floor, and the mask went flying, revealing the face beneath. To my horror, it was a woman, a disheveled, wild-eyed woman who appeared to be in her 30s. She groaned in pain, blood trickling from her nose. Mark, awakened by the commotion, rushed into the room, his eyes wide with shock. "What the hell is going on?" he exclaimed. I stammered, struggling to find words. There's someone here." She was in the living room. Mark's gaze shifted from me to the injured intruder on the floor. "We need to call the police," he said firmly, reaching for his phone. As Mark dialed 911, we kept a cautious eye on the woman, who lay on the floor, moaning and clutching her bleeding nose. It was a surreal and terrifying situation, one that had turned our peaceful cabin retreat into a nightmarish ordeal. Within what felt like an eternity, we heard the distant wail of sirens approaching through the woods. The police arrived shortly thereafter, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they approached the cabin. They took the intruder into custody, and we gave our statements, recounting the chilling events of the night. The woman's name was Lisa, and she claimed that she had stumbled upon the cabin while wandering through the woods, disoriented and lost. She insisted that she meant no harm and had come seeking shelter. Her story was bizarre, but the police found no evidence to suggest otherwise. We were left with more questions than answers. Why had Lisa been in the woods alone, and how had she found our remote cabin? What had driven her to wear that eerie mask and make those unnerving sounds in the middle of the night? The police eventually released Lisa with a warning, and we were left to grapple with the unsettling aftermath of the incident. We decided to stay at the cabin for the remainder of our trip, albeit with a heightened sense of unease. We locked all the doors and windows, keeping our guard up even during the daylight hours. The incident cast a shadow over our idyllic getaway, and we couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss in those woods. Each rustling of leaves or distant hoot of an owl seemed to carry a sinister undertone. As the days passed, we tried to put the unsettling encounter behind us. We ventured out into the woods less frequently, choosing to spend our time indoors, playing board games and reading. The nights remained eerily quiet, with no further disturbances. On the final evening of our stay, with our departure scheduled for the next morning, Mark and I decided to build a bonfire near the cabin. We thought it might help us unwind and shake off the residual unease from the earlier events. The fire crackled and danced, casting its warm, flickering light into the surrounding darkness. We sat in silence, lost in our thoughts, when suddenly, a distant sound reached our ears, a faint, haunting melody carried by the night breeze. It was a tune we couldn't quite place, ethereal and mournful. We exchanged puzzled glances, the unease creeping back into our hearts. The melody grew louder, drawing nearer, until it became unmistakable, a woman's voice, singing a haunting song in a language we couldn't understand. The voice was hauntingly beautiful yet filled with an eerie sadness that sent shivers down our spines. As the singing approached the cabin, we scrambled to our feet, our eyes scanning the surrounding darkness. And then, emerging from the shadows, we saw her, Lisa, the intruder from that fateful night, standing just beyond the edge of the firelight. Her presence sent a chill down my spine, and I could see the same grotesque mask from that night hanging around her neck. She continued to sing, her voice captivating and unnerving in equal measure. It was as if she was drawing us in, beckoning us to follow her into the darkness. Mark and I exchanged frantic whispers, debating whether to call the police again or confront her ourselves. But before we could make a decision, Lisa's song reached a haunting crescendo, and she turned and disappeared into the woods, her voice fading into the distance. We hesitated for only a moment before we made our choice. We couldn't let her vanish into the night, leaving us with more questions and unresolved fear. We grabbed flashlights and followed the sound of her singing, trudging through the underbrush, our hearts pounding in our chests. The woods seemed to close in around us, the trees casting long, eerie shadows in the beam of our flashlights. The singing led us deeper into the forest, as if we were being lured into an otherworldly realm. It was a surreal and terrifying experience, one that defied explanation. Finally, we reached a small clearing, and there she stood, Lisa, her back to us, still singing that haunting melody. But this time, she was not alone. Other figures, masked and silent, emerged from the darkness, surrounding her in a circle. Fear gripped us as we realized that we had stumbled upon something inexplicable and malevolent. The masked figures began to move, their movements synchronized and ritualistic. They raised their arms and chanted in a language that sent shivers down our spines. We watched in horror as Lisa turned to face us, her eyes locking onto ours. The mask she wore seemed to meld with her face, becoming a grotesque part of her identity. And then, with a sudden, frenzied burst of movement, the figures lunged toward us. We turned and ran, our flashlights cutting through the darkness as we fled through the woods. The chanting and singing echoed behind us, growing louder and more menacing with each passing moment. We didn't dare look back, our only thought to escape the clutches of whatever malevolent force had taken hold of that forest. Hours later, we stumbled out of the woods, our bodies bruised and hearts still racing. We made our way back to the cabin, hastily packed our belongings, and left that eerie place behind, vowing never to return. To this day, the memory of that cabin in the woods haunts my dreams. I can still hear Lisa's haunting melody and the chanting of the masked figures. I can still feel the inexplicable fear that gripped us that night, and the realization that there are mysteries in this world that defy explanation. We never did find out who Lisa and those masked figures were, or what dark purpose had brought them to that remote cabin. But one thing is certain, we were lucky to escape with our lives, and will forever carry the chilling memory of that fateful night in the woods.